Okay guys, so in this video I thought I was going to talk to you a little bit about circular dependencies, so let's get into it. So first and foremost we need to talk about what is a circular dependency. Well, the basic idea is that if you have a module of say foo and you require say bar, and then it turns out that bar is actually requiring foo, you have a circle. And in other words, basically you're just trying to require something that is already requiring the thing that you are requiring. And in most languages this will actually break your code, but not in Node. And what's going to happen is that Node is going to try to help you out. Basically what's going to happen is that you are going to receive, foo is going to receive, when it's asking for bar, it's going to receive an unfinished copy of the module that it is requiring. And then once bar or b is resolved, foo will actually be loaded correctly. And in other words, once the circular dependency has been resolved, Node will actually load in the code that is missing. Now, the problem with this is that it is going to hide quite a few issues you may find in your code, and it doesn't always work. Sometimes it works. And I will show you a few examples of how this behaves during certain circumstances. But basically, what I will argue is that it is a better approach for you and for us all to not have circular dependencies to begin with, and that is of course easier said than done, especially in a large code base. But let's just walk through the symptoms of how you can figure out if you actually have a circular dependency. Now, usually what happens is that it manifests itself in the following way. So I have this little, like, you see the little application here that I load, and there's something, it says cannot read property debug of undefined. Okay, let's have a look at that. So if we go to the file that in question that is causing the issue, which is my config.js file over here, then we see that, okay, so that's the line that is the problem, and we're importing some logger or something. All right, let's go into that. And weird, okay, so it says that this doesn't exist, but I can very clearly see that it does exist. And okay, let's go into services. So here we are doing a bunch of stuff. We'll talk about this code in just a moment, but we can also see here that logger is being instantiated by config.appName, and then it's just exporting that logger. So I know for a fact that we are actually, like, we're getting that. Like, this class has been instantiated, it has this method, everything looks to be okay. When you see this sort of thing, when you can see that the error message is something of this like, and you can very clearly see that, hey, you actually do have this thing, it's actually usually it's the best tell to figure out if you have a circular dependency. We can actually go and just have a little bit of a look at this and say something along the lines of console.log.logger. Let's do that. And then let's rebuild this with Webpack. And ta-da, start the server, and then let's take a run at this again. And there you are. So logger is undefined. So why is logger undefined? We clearly saw it. Well, as I said, because the resolution of this module hasn't worked properly. It's simply not possible. Basically, the circular dependency resolution hasn't worked. So let's have a bit of a look at this application to just kind of figure out what's going on here first and foremost before we start looking into this. So we have this server, and it's just a dummy server that just kind of illustrate this idea or this concept. And then we have our application, which is our entire application, and all it is a application that tries to show that it's possible. Like, this is, I'm not going to tell you to write code like this, guys. This is just for demo purposes. But in order to create some example where you can find yourself in a situation where this actually happens, I needed to create some code that wasn't all that trivial, because I don't think that the point will get across if I don't make it a little bit more advanced. So we have this service which calls create user, and what's interesting about this is that I can actually run this in both the browser and in Node. and we will have its code that will run in both. And the reason why it works that way is because we have this little user service here, which we have defined. And the idea here is that you should be able to have these common interfaces where you share code both on the server and on the client. And for that to work, you say that you have a storage system like the user service here that can store a user. Well, if you have, let's say that for the sake of argument that you are in the browser, then you would have one interface, which, well, this is the interface for the browser, and this would be, I've just faked the Node implementation where you could go to the actual database, and that way you can actually use this service both in the browser and in on the client in Node, basically, because what you're doing here is that you're simply passing in the storage object that holds the interface that is going to connect to the database. And since this can be anything, what's interesting, what the idea here is basically is that if you are in the browser, as we can see here, we have a configuration that tells us which mode we're in. So if we're in the browser, we're going to use the browser storage interface, which is this. It's the same, like the same function. The difference is that instead of going directly to the database, it goes to our server and does the same operation. And the server then is responsible for actually saving this to the database. So we could actually use this service both in our endpoint, in the server here, we could put this here, and we can use it on the client. So I thought that was a kind of good idea, a good way of illustrating this, because what we now have is this situation where we need to express where we are using our configuration file, and this is the sort of thing that can very quickly become this sort of issue. So enough talking about that. So how do we fix this? Like, how do we figure out where the issue lies in all of this? How do we figure out basically where our circular dependency is and how to solve it? I mean, in this situation, it would be maybe easy for us to figure it out because there's not that much code. But when you have a lot of code, this is going to get really, really messy really quickly. So what I like to do is that I have a tool that I use for this, which is called Madge. You don't have to use this one. It's just, well, it's just one of the tools that you could use for this. And basically, if we simply run this, what it's going to do is that it's going to tell us where our circular dependencies are. Nifty. So we see here that number 7 here, like these over here are expected because we're going to just have a few examples where I show you a few cases. And the service here, service/index, is pointing to the user service, and the user service is pointing back at that. So let's have a look at this. Let's go and have a look. So here we are in the user service, and as we expect, we are importing the user service and the login service, instantiating these and exporting them as instantiated objects. Okay, cool. But then if we look at the user service, okay, here we have the problem. So what's happening here is that we are trying to grab the logger from the index.js file, which is the same file that we are using to import our service. Okay, that should be an easy fix. So instead, what I like to do here is that, and this is why I always try to keep everything in directories, because now I have to find a way to not have this circulation anymore. I have to structure my modules in such a way that I can create a linear dependency without this circulation. And the easiest way that I can think of to do that is to have the login service as a separate thing, like this, and then have a separate function, have an index.js file where I actually do the instantiation like this. So now I can simply reference, instead of grabbing the logger that way, I can reference the logging service directly, like that. If we go over to my terminal and we run it, we can see that now that indeed solved the problem. So now there's no longer a circulation. And this idea of breaking things out into what I call leaf files is going to kind of be the red thread through all of this. But let's look at the next one. So config to index in utils. All right, let's look at the config. So the config here is just a function, it's just an instantiation to kind of get some information and store some common information for the application. So we have some type of either function, and we import app name. We'll look at that later, why we're doing that. We're grabbing the logger, and then we're logging out some information when we run these two functions, which is going to return something, don't really know. All right, and then we have this either function, which is just a higher order function that is going to basically, what it will do is that it will run one of these functions depending on the evaluation of the thing that you're passing in. Let's actually look at the actual implementation. So all it's going to do is that it's just a function that takes two other functions and it takes an expression. If the expression is truthy, we're going to call right, otherwise we're going to call left, and that's basically it. So we have that, which is now going to look at the global and global.window to make sure. Okay, so I think I get this. So basically the idea here is that we want to check if we're in the browser or not. And that's the whole idea here, where if we are in the browser, we are going to reference this environmental variable that we get from Webpack, because we are using the define plugin so that we can actually inject this variable into our JavaScript and instantiate it as browser, because if we're running things through Webpack, we want to be able to communicate to our service here which mode we are running in. Cool. So here we are. This seems to be our problem area. So what was the message again? The message was, all right, so config is grabbing utils.index. Okay, this is what's happening. So I'm grabbing this file here with all of these helper functions, and that is in turn looking back at my file, at the config file. Okay, that's the problem right there. So in order to solve this one, we might have to do the same thing that we did last time. We're going to have to think about, okay, how can we create a leaf file, or like break out this dependency structure? So the way that I do this, as I touched on earlier, is that I create a folder where I have an entry point into my module, quote unquote, which is the index file. And this is, like, I treat this as just a convenience, and it should only be a convenience. But the important thing here is that now that I've found that I have this circular dependency, if I look at my config, what I actually want from this module is just the either. So maybe if I just grab the either instead of the entire file, because a lot of people get confused by this destructuring. Guys, just because you destructure something doesn't mean that you're not requiring the file. You're still loading all of that. It's just that you're grabbing one single value from that entire module. And that's not the same thing as just requiring the thing that you need. And that's something that I think you should be aware of. You should, if possible, break things out in such a way that you can either grab everything for convenience purposes, or explicitly say that this is the thing that I want. There are a few libraries like Lodash, for example, that you can take a look at that does this exact thing, where the root directory is going to have one entry point that exports everything in the library, so you can grab everything if you want it, or each individual function that the library supports as a specific file. And that's the pattern that we want here. So we have this either here, and now that we have a circular dependency, we can't do this anymore. So let's do this instead. Let's do this. Either. So now we are no longer grabbing everything in utilities, because we don't want that. We just want to grab the either. And then let's run this again. Cool. Another dependency, another circulation gone, because now we are no longer connecting these two files. Awesome. So finally we have this services index.js, and that is going to point at the config. Okay, let's look at that. Let's go back here. Okay, so here we are, we're grabbing the config, and what are we using the config for? Okay, so the config is getting the URLs, and it's grabbing the save user, and it's going to grab the mode, and it's going to grab the app name. Okay, that's quite a lot of dependencies right there. I wonder if we could maybe figure this out in some way. All right, so once again, we're pointing at this logger directly. Okay, but maybe we can simplify this in the same way. Let's do this. Let's grab the logging service and try that. Oh, okay, that wasn't all that good either. So what happens now? All right, it seems that we almost made this worse. So now we're okay, so config is pointing at the logging service, and the logging service is or that index.js file is pointing to the logging service, like the actual class file, and that is pointing at utils.index. Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. So we are grabbing the logger here from this file here, and that is grabbing the config. Okay, maybe we can resolve this. And that is where this app name idea came out. So, okay, we don't want everything from the config, we just want the app name. And that's where this comes in. So I split this out and I put it over here instead to see if I could do that. So let's see if we can fix it that way. Let's see. So I go here, and instead of grabbing the app name like that, I'm going to grab the app name like this. Change that app name. Okay, cool. So now we don't have that hard dependency circulation anymore. Or rather, we're not grabbing more than we want. Damn, we're still in this problem. Okay, let's try it again. So config is looking at this file, which is looking at the logging service, which is still looking at the utilities. All right, let's go into the logging service, because we now know that there's no hard dependency between this file and like the config. So let's see if we can, let's just go into the logging service. Okay, so here's our logging service. And here we have a bunch of log functions and some error tracking to capture errors and stuff like that. Okay, cool. And this is where the problem lies. Okay, so because we are depending on, so let's just walk through this. Config is pointing at the logging service index file. This file is requiring the logging service, and this file is requiring the utilities, which in turn is requiring the config file. So there is our circulation. So now I hope this is making sense to you. So what's happened is that, I mean, this entire structure here is something that we need to account for. We have several layers of requirements that lead back to us. And guys, this, I'm going to be honest with you, this is not that uncommon, especially in a large code base. This can be an even longer chain if you're really unlucky, where you have a really long require chain. So it's important to be aware of these sorts of things when you're working. Cool. So maybe we can see if we can figure this one out, because maybe we can actually use the strategy that we've been using so far, where, okay, we have a directory which has an entry point of some sort where we can export everything that we want to export for a convenience thing, but we also split out the things that are so-called, as I said, it doesn't have to be leaves, but I like to call it that, leaf files that in themselves are just basically not going to require anything else inside of the project, so we can explicitly say that we want that thing instead of the whole thing. Let's see if we can do this here with this config, because the problem is that the logging service, this unfortunately has a hard, I mean, all of these functions here, they are required in order to do the logic here. We can't just throw them away, but maybe we can put them in separate files. Let's investigate that. Okay, so let's look at these things here. So log info seems to be a pure function that has a dependency to get date, and get date is just, yeah, it's also it's not a pure function, but it's just using, it doesn't have any dependencies. So we could move that out, but then we still have these labels that is causing an issue. Okay, so that's not gonna work. And the log debug function takes the mode and that checks it through the browser, and it's going to use one of these log functions depending on that. So this is a bit of a problem. Moving these functions out into separate files will actually not work, because all that's going to happen is that I'm still going to have to grab this config in that separate file, because there's a hard dependency between this function and my configuration, and since there's a hard connection between my logging service and these functions, I'm kind of stuck. I can't really, this dependency structure will not work. I have to rethink my code basically in order for this to make any type of sense, or to be able to solve this. And these are the sorts of things that you should carry with you. So to finally show you just an example of the different scenarios that we've been touching on so far, let's look at these example files here. So I have this actually let's make that a little bit smaller so we can see it. So I have this module a.js that requires B, and B has a name, and then we have B, and that's just in turn requiring A and grabbing the name of A. So if I now run this a.js like that, it's not going to break, because I'm simply referencing a property in a.js and logging that property out. The name but basically what we can see here is that B is not is actually not getting the name, and that this is kind of where, as I said, this is the problem. You're trying to, like, Node cannot resolve this for you, and this is the manifestation of that basically. So if we look at a more dangerous example, if you have the same sort of structure but there's a function instead, like this, your code will actually explode, as we saw in the more elaborate example of this. So what's important to remember here, guys, is to actually continuously make sure that you're not creating these circular dependencies, either through tools or through using, as I said, like, you can actually create these leaf files and really be specific, like explicitly say that I want that file or that function. Don't just grab everything and destructure it, because if you do that, odds are that this is going to happen to you. And then we have an example of where you can kind of hack around this. I'm not a fan of this. It's a hack. To me, this is basically just a hack. What we can do is that if we're using requires, we can actually make this resolve, and we can make it resolve simply because requires dynamically evaluated, and since I'm exporting the module that in this module before I'm actually requiring the next module, this will actually resolve. Now this works with requires, but it will not work with ES6 imports, because the magic is in this line here. Because this is going before, like this is being exported before I'm actually grabbing my external module, this is basically why it works. And then finally, I will show you one final scenario where this can also be due to a timing issue. So you have to be very careful with this. You can also, if you're not in the module scope of things, but you're basically just calling things through a function or something like that, you can actually make it resolve as well. And this is also a really bad thing. Like this is just a problem waiting to happen, because there is a car dependency between B4, which is just, I mean, these are just reflections of each other between this module and, well, and that module. So B4 and A4 are depending on each other, and you will simply not know, because you have structured your code in such a way that the module resolution system that Node uses can actually solve this for you. So what I want you to take away from this is that circular dependencies is a tricky subject. If you find that you have this error where it's saying that, all right, I can't find undefined, it's just undefined, and you can very clearly see that, hey, I can find this method myself, or this function, or this value by just stepping through the code, odds are that you have a circular dependency, and then you have to kind of go through this sort of process that I just showed you. Hopefully this was useful to you. Have a great day.